I'm joined now by North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Allison Riggs. Justice Riggs, it's been 5 months since you won your election in November of 2024. Still, there hasn't been a winner determined in this election, even though, again, you had more votes than your opponent, Jefferson Griffin. Can you give us a lay of the land in terms of where everything stands right now in this last election that still has yet to be decided from 2024?
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Brian. I'm really honored to be able to share with your listeners what's happening here in North Carolina and the threat it poses for democracy across this country. So Saturday is the five month mark since the election. Every time I hit one of these anniversaries, it becomes sadder and sadder that we're
Right.
still trying to get resolution to the last uncertified 2024 race in the entire country. It's been a week and 3 days since my case was heard in the North Carolina Court of Appeals. We're waiting on a decision from that state intermediate court. The panel had some tough questions. It was comprised of 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And my opponent's attorneys, in oral argument just over a week ago, were crystal clear that what they were seeking was not some sort of post-election process for voters to fix their voter registration or any kind of cure process. They were flat out saying, toss these ballots. 68,000 lawful ballots cast by eligible North Carolina voters, including both of my parents and 5,500 overseas and deployed military voters. They want those votes tossed. So if the North Carolina Court of Appeals agrees with my opponent and argues that these ballots should be tossed, and maybe even if they don't, this case next is going to go to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And I think we still have 6 to 9 months left of this fight because we will go back to federal court if we need to. If anyone argues that an eligible vote should be discounted, that's disenfranchisement in violation of federal law and the federal Constitution. And it is my job to defend the constitutional rights of North Carolinians.
Well, I mean, it's disenfranchisement in the clearest, most egregious sense of the term. And so what's the rationale that they're giving to be able to blatantly disenfranchise 68,000 North Carolinians?
I can tell you what they're saying and what they said in oral argument. It's still going to leave you somewhat dissatisfied and confused because
I presume it will. I presume it will leave me dissatisfied, but go on.
They're saying they just want the election laws enforced as they existed for the election, but that's not true. 32,000 military voters voted using what's called a UOCAVA ballot. It's a federal ballot designed to make it easier for deployed military overseas to vote. So in North Carolina, 32,000 people used that vote. There was on the State Board of Elections website, on every county board of elections site, on federal voting assistance websites, notices that overseas deployed military don't have to make a copy of their picture ID to vote. So this is it's undisputed that that's what voters were told the rules were, and the voters did what they were told. And my opponent is now saying after the fact, oh, well, that was wrong. But they had plenty of time to object to that. These postings were up months and months before the election. So tossing these ballots, these 5,500 military ballots are also only from 4 of the most Democratic counties in North Carolina, and there's 100 of those counties. That's not following the law in place before the election. It's rewriting the rules and punishing voters who followed the rules to a T and punishing them for that. It is absolutely not allowed under state law or federal law. And I promise you, I will not give an inch on this. If I have to fight this all the way to the United States Supreme Court, I will, because I put my hand on the Bible and swore an oath to God that I would stand up for the rights of every North Carolinian, even the ones who didn't vote for me, to make sure that their voice is heard at the ballot box. And this most precious fundamental right, the right that is preservative of all of our other rights, is respected.
So let's talk about the processes as they're going to play themselves out right now. You are in front of the North Carolina Appeals Court. There is still the North Carolina Supreme Court on which you sit, but you're recused from this case for obvious reasons. So what is the partisan makeup of the appeals court, and what's the partisan makeup of the state Supreme Court?
Right. And just to remind your listeners, not every state has judges who run as partisans, but our Republican legislature decided a few years ago that it would be great for judges to run as Democrats or Republicans. So on the Court of Appeals, there are 12 Republicans and 3 Democrats. On the North Carolina Supreme Court, where I sit, there are 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats. So I'm one of the only 2 Democrats. And I won't decide my own election, but that remaining body of 6 will be who, unfortunately, seems like it's going to look like they get to decide who wins the election. But in reality, voters decide who wins an election.
Right, but then again, it's 2025, and this is the MAGA Republican Party, and so they're perfectly content to consolidate power however they see fit. And that is my editorializing, not yours. But in the event where, for example, they rule in favor of your opponent, Jefferson Griffin, on the appeals court, and this goes up to the state Supreme Court, and like you said, without you ruling on your own case, we're in a situation where it's 5-1 Republican to Democrat. I know that there are folks on that court who are already have a tendency toward your opponent anyway. And so in the event that they rule in his favor, what happens from there? I mean, that isn't the end of the line. Does it then jump into the federal court system?
So we spent an early part of this year trying to get this matter resolved in federal court because there are
right, for obvious reasons, right?
Right. Federal laws. So the way in which military voters overseas vote is dictated by federal law. We have the Help America Vote Act, which dictates how people register to vote. We have a number of federal laws and our federal constitution that are implicated by my opponent's challenge. So we wanted this to be decided in federal court. The federal court said, we're going to let the state court we're going to show respect to another judiciary. We're going to let the state court decide issues of state law. But they created some guardrails. They said, if what happens in state court you think violates federal law, it's called retaining jurisdiction, but they essentially kept a hand on this case to say, we'll come back to this if we need to. And so if what happens in the North Carolina state courts requires even one eligible North Carolina vote be tossed, you can be sure that I will be going to federal court the next day saying this is wrong. If our democracy is to mean anything, it requires an independent judiciary say that people in power don't get to change election outcomes or toss ballots because they don't like the outcome.
So this would be in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals as far as the federal court system is concerned. What is the partisan breakdown? And it's a shame that I have to ask this question because the question I should be asking here is, did you win the election? And so when will it be decided? When will it be certified and decided? And when can we move on? But we don't live in that world anymore. And so the question that I'm forced to ask now is, what's the partisan breakdown of the appeals court in state? What's the partisan breakdown of the North Carolina State Supreme Court? What's the partisan breakdown of the Fourth Circuit Federal Appeals Court? What's the partisan breakdown of the U.S. Supreme Court? That's just a sad commentary on the world we live in today. But what is the partisan breakdown of that appeals court?
Yeah, so my case will first go to a trial court in the Eastern District of North Carolina, and we've been assigned to Chief Judge Myers, who was a Trump appointee. If we are unsuccessful there, then we'll appeal to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. There are 15 members of that court. 8 of them were appointed. So federal judges aren't partisan. They're appointed by a partisan president, but they themselves don't hold partisan office. There are 8 members of that 15-member court who were appointed by Democrats and 7 who were appointed by Republicans. And
either way, it's going up to the U.S. Supreme Court. At one side or the other will appeal up to the Supreme Court. Is there any indication as to how the U.S. Supreme Court would rule on this, given the specifics of your case?
Well, so this is a case where I feel very comfortable and confident in the arguments that we're making in federal court, because remember, I'm a former voting rights attorney. So there were cases that I litigated over 15 years where we said, hey, this voting law violates constitutional rights or the Voting Rights Act. This redistricting plan is unfair and it wouldn't let Black voters pick the candidate of their choice. And when we took those cases to the US Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court frequently said to me and my clients, we're not changing election laws close to an election. If we do that, even if you're right, if we do that, it causes mass disruption. It undermines faith in the electoral process. It's called the Purcell principle. And so I know this principle. I've been at the losing end of it. But that principle, as it applies here, means that my opponent can't challenge or change voting laws after the election is over.
Well, it seems pretty cut and dry, and yet here we are. Look, I have a 30,000-foot question, and that is like, you're a member of the North Carolina Supreme Court in a court system that a lot of people want to have faith works, and yet we see an instance like this where it is so obvious what's happening and so obviously antithetical to what the law actually says, and yet there is a degree of confidence that at least the North Carolina Supreme Court, which again is going to be 5-1 in deciding this case, that's the partisan breakdown, that the majority of them may very well rule in favor of your opponent, despite the fact that his legal argument is completely baseless, despite the fact that what you're putting forward is so cut and dry, and despite the fact that if the roles were reversed, there would be no question how they would rule. And so how do you retain faith in a system and participate in a system that's breaking down, that is acting in a way that is completely antithetical to how it's supposed to act?
So it's a great question, and I understand people's frustration. What I believe in the power of our institutions in a democratic society to act as guardrails. And so when we look at in other countries where democracies have died, where autocracies have rooted, it's because the institutions like the court have failed. They have failed to rein in the worst of corruption and power and greed. And it doesn't have to be that way. And in North Carolina, where we elect judges, this is an opportunity for me to paint a picture to North Carolinians, and in fact to people across the country, of what you should be expecting both of your judges and your courts. And so to me, this is an opportunity for me to say to the 68,000 voters whose ballots are at risk of being tossed, you deserve a judge on the Supreme Court or Court of Appeals, whoever, who will fight for your right to vote, even if you didn't vote for that person. So I have talked to Republicans whose ballots are at stake. My opponent is disproportionately challenging voters who lean Democratic, young voters, right, voters of color, women. But there are Republicans in that mix. There are unaffiliateds in that mix. And I want people to recognize that I believe in our institutions. We deserve to have courts that are an independent branch, are willing to enforce the checks and balances that our democracy needs to thrive. And, at least on this state level, protect us if the federal system won't. And so I am not hopelessly naive, but I am using this as an opportunity to show people what character looks like, what constitutional convictions look like, and what it means to put people and the Constitution over politics.
Well, look, you have shown more grace and class in 5 minutes than your Republican opponent and his enablers in the judicial system have throughout the entirety of this process. So I'll keep having you on and talking about this so that this doesn't, disappear or slip away. I know that there's a lot of shit going on in the country right now, and that distraction really redounds to Republicans' benefits so that they can do stuff like this. But we'll keep talking about it, and anything that we can do to be helpful, anything that we can do to spotlight you and this campaign, we'll continue to do so. So I'll talk to you very soon, and thank you again for continuing to fight this fight.
Thank you, Brian.